Are we ready? Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Marshall Gittler, Head of Investment Research at FXPRIMUS. And today I'm going to be talking about the upcoming U.S. presidential election. Let me say a few things. Personally, I am 61 years old. I'll soon be 62. So I've seen a large number of elections. This is the oddest one I have ever seen in my life. And some people claim it is the oddest one ever. So what I'm going to talk about today is not just the election, because you can't really understand the election unless you understand the whole US political system, what the president does, elect the president, and then we could go to discuss what the candidates are and what their impact on the US economy would likely to be, and how they might affect the currencies. But first, we have to understand the political system of the United States before we can understand exactly what's going on and the importance of all of this. So I'm going to first go through the structure of the U.S. government, what can the president do and what he can do. Then I'm going to explain how the United States elects a president. It's not really very straightforward, in fact, system. They discuss which candidate's likely to win, and then what each of their policies are and how they might affect the currencies. Now, first off, as for the US government, it's made up of three parts, three distinct parts: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. This branch is the president, legislative branch is Congress, and the judicial branch is basically the court system. So here we're talking about the president, who is head of the executive branch of the government. Now, what does the executive branch do? It executes the laws. That's why it's called the executive branch, because it executes. The president carries out the federal laws. He can recommend, he or she can recommend new ones, but the president doesn't make the laws directly. Does have a lot of power in national defense and foreign policy. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and the president controls foreign policy. Plus, of course, the president performs ceremonial duties. Right now, President Obama is in Israel for Shimon Peres's funeral, for example. The powers include directing the government, as I said, commanding the armed forces, dealing with other countries, acting as the chief law enforcement officer, and, quite importantly, as we'll see in a few minutes, vetoing laws passed by Congress. So why do people put so much focus on the president? Why do people think that the president has like magical powers to control the economy? Why do they think that it doesn't? Actually, the president doesn't. But the president does have a lot of power. But a lot of power. First off, the president prepares the budget. So the president has a large impact on fiscal policy. But the president presents the budget to Congress, but Congress has to pass the budget. So Congress actually makes the budget. And the fact is, in the recent years, they haven't even passed the budget because they can't agree on it. So in theory, the president has this power over the budget, but in fact, the president doesn't have this. The president appoints, that's from fiscal policy. From monetary policy, the president appoints the chair of the Federal Reserve and appoints members of the 7-member Federal Board of Governors. Now, there are 7 Fed governors, and they obviously have the majority, the voting majority on the 12-member Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. So the president appoints the majority of the FOMC. Actually, these people have 14-year terms, and the president, even if he or she is reelected, only gets 8 years. So in theory, the president, and the terms are staggered, so in theory, the president can only appoint the chair and 2 members. But the governors are terms. Recently, they've all resigned early. So both President Bush and President Obama have appointed all the governors of the Fed. So they have a lot of control over who controls monetary policy. They don't control monetary policy themselves, but it's their appointees. Similarly, the president can shape the policies of economic agencies by appointing their heads, like the Federal Trade Commission, which is in charge of agreeing or not agreeing to mergers and acquisitions. The Environmental Protection Agency, which sets environmental standards, pollution standards. The Federal Drug Administration, which approves or disapproves. So they have a lot of control over the regulation of the U.S. economy. Negotiates treaties. This is a big issue right now, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, between America, Europe, and the Asian countries. Huge trade agreement. But while the president agrees on, negotiates them, they have to be approved by the Senate. So it's not a done deal, even if he or she makes the treaty. And finally, the president appoints the Supreme Court judges, because it could be that in the next 8 years, 4 of the 9 Supreme Court judges retire. And so that will shape American policy for decades to come, Now, the legislative branch, that's Congress, basically. Congress is made up of 2 parts. The House of Representatives, where each state gets a number of representatives that depends on, proportionate to their population. So California has like 38, a huge state like California, I think it's 38, maybe. Whereas smaller states would only get 2, I think it is. And the Senate, where each of the 50 states gets 2 representatives. There's millions and millions of people, has 2 people in the Senate. And Rhode Island, which has about 600,000 people, has 2 people in the Senate. This, by the way, is the country that invaded Iraq in order to bring democracy to Iraq. You can see there's no democracy in America if the people in Rhode Island have the same voting power as the people in California. But this comes from the way the U.S. was, when it was established back in 1792, and there were just 13 small states, and each of them had pretty much the same population. They never dreamed they would have this kind of discrepancy in the size. And back then each state was more like an independent country, more like in Europe. And they couldn't agree. I imagine Europe trying to set up a similar system. Obviously, Latvia and Estonia wouldn't like Germany and France dictating everything. So this is the kind of system they set up. Now, the legislative branch makes the laws. So they pass the laws. They originate, this House originates spending bills, but then they have to be passed by the Senate. They can impeach officials. You may remember Bill Clinton they impeached Bill Clinton a few years ago. These have to be approved by the Senate. Finally, there's the judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court. They interpret the Constitution, they review the laws, and they try to make sure that everybody agrees, everybody is playing by the same rules, which are set out in the Constitution. So, I don't know, the Congress might make a law saying that all people with blue eyes have to pay twice as much taxes as people with green eyes. But that would not, the Supreme Court would then judge that this was not constitutional, and they could strike down the law. One of the things I want to emphasize from this, a lot of people say that, well, the US government is dysfunctional, it isn't working, they can't get anything done. A mistake. This is not a bug in the system. This is the design of the system. It was designed to work badly. Each of these 3 groups can check and balance the other ones. And that's the way it was set up to be. Because the people who designed the system back in the 1790s didn't trust people. They were afraid of a dictatorship. So they wanted to put in all these checks and balances so that nobody could control the whole system. And right now they can't get anything done, and that's the way it's supposed to be. The Congress can pass laws, and the president vetoes them, and the Supreme Court strikes them down as unconstitutional. That's exactly the function. So you can see that the powers of the president are greatly circumscribed. It does have some powers indeed. Now, how the people elect the president, this is quite bizarre. This is a really unique system. Voters don't directly vote for the president. 40 million people vote for Obama, 39 million people voted for Mitt Romney. Obama wins. They don't vote directly for the president. They vote for electors. Each state gets a number of, the people vote for the electors from their state. Those electors then, in early January, I think it is, go to Washington and they vote for the president. Again, as I said, the people who framed who set up the U.S. government didn't trust people. They didn't trust anyone. So they were worried that ignorant people might vote for somebody. Can I say that? Well, I won't say it. But they were worried that that people wouldn't really know who to vote for. So they had it set up so that people would vote for somebody who they could know, who was an intelligent and well-informed person, and then those people would go to Washington and they would vote for the president. So it's sort of representative voting for the president. So the system has changed. The electors pledge to vote for for a certain candidate. So really, you are electing an elector who will then go and elect the person who you want to be elected. Now, each state gets one elector for every person in the House of Representatives, one for every Senate person. That means there are 538 total electors, 438 in the House of Representatives, 100 in the Senate. There are 50 states in America. 48 of them allocate the electors on a winner-take-all system. This is really the key to it. So what this means is you don't need to win 50% of the votes. You only need to win 50% of the votes in the states that control 50% of the electoral votes. Even if you got no votes at all in the other states, it wouldn't matter. So that's why it's possible to win the election without a majority of the votes. In fact, President Bush did it. It's happened several times in American history. On the other hand, it's very difficult, although not impossible, to win without winning a few certain large states, because they have so many electoral votes that it's very difficult to assemble 500, whatever it is, 270 votes without winning those few large states. And just a little sidelight, over 130 times, I think it is, the electors have voted for people other than the one they're voted to pledge for. So, believe it or not, the election isn't settled really on November 8th or 9th, whenever it is this year. It's only settled once the electors go to vote. It could be that the electors get there and decide that they don't like the person that they were nominated to vote for, and they could vote in Angela Merkel. Well, she's not an American citizen, so anyway, you get the idea. It's never happened. It's happened that a few people have voted for other ones, but never enough to tip the vote, obviously. So this is what the Electoral College map looks like. The left-hand map shows each of the 50 states and how many electoral votes they get. The blue ones are ones that voted Democrat. The red ones are ones that voted Republican in 2012. The color shows the strength of the majority that each party had, that the winning party had each. The graph on the right is the same graph, but reshaped so that the size of each state depends on how many electoral votes they get. Well, I'm sorry, California has 55. And what you can see is that there are a few very large states, and those states are very important. Now, one of the key things I'd like to point out here is some of these states will never vote for anyone else. It hasn't happened in decades that California, for example, has voted for a Republican candidate for president. It is not going to vote for, although Texas did have Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat, but I think since then they've gone totally Republican. So there are just a few large states that are changeable. And those are called the swing states. And those are really the few states that determine the whole election. Now, this table here shows you how many electoral has. They're ranked in size. And when you get to cumulative, that shows you the cumulative number of votes. And what you'll see is the top 11 states have 270 electoral votes. That's how many votes you need to get to win the election. There are 538 electors. Half of that is 269, plus one vote is 270. 11 states really only have 57% of the population. So if you got 51% of the vote of 57% of the population, you could win, and it wouldn't matter what the other 39 states did at all. But it's even worse since not everybody votes. Actually, only about 60% of the people vote. So if we take only 60% of the vote, in theory, you could win the election with as few as 17% of the voters if you got 51% of 57.5% of the vote in those states. So it's these large states that are really the battleground states. And this is the who won in 2012, the blue being Obama, the red being Romney. Obama obviously won. 2000, when Bush won, back and forth between these two. From flashing up the states, the very few states that changed. Florida were the two big ones. If Bush had lost either of those, he would have lost the election. Colorado, because Colorado state, that's very important for Hillary Clinton this time. If she loses Colorado, she may not have enough states to make up. See why Ohio and Florida, which both have a lot of votes, 47 electoral votes between them, keys to this election, particularly Florida. What was it, 6 or 8 states people. Now, the reason this is so important and the reason people are really counting the states is because the vote is so close. The polls give Clinton nationally only a 3.3 percentage point advantage. And it's not much higher than that in those very important swing states. Florida. In fact, one reason this is such a unique election is Hillary, look at, this is a graph of the popularity of these people. If you look at the left-hand side, Hillary Clinton, she is the second least popular person ever nominated for president. The graph on the left, the red line is the percentage of people who have an unfavorable view of her. The black line is the percentage of a favorable view. So her net position is -14. You have to understand the Republican Party has been bashing this lady since she became First Lady in 1993. They've just raked her over the coals. They called her every name in the book. They sued her. It's just unbelievable. But you know, you repeat a lie long enough, people start to believe it. A lot of people don't trust her, or at least don't like her. And that's the older people. The younger people prefer Bernie Sanders, who appealed to them much more. So she's very unpopular. She's the second most unpopular person ever to run. We have polls. Who is the most unpopular? Mr. Trump, the guy on the right. His net position is -22. He has zero, I repeat, zero support among Black people. Little support among Hispanics. Many women hate this guy, and with good reason. I don't know if you saw the debates or anything from the debates earlier in the week. In an hour and a half, he interrupted Hillary Clinton 51 times. The things he has said about women. I can't even repeat them. And even a lot of Republicans hate him because, well, I won't go into this. He's just an extraordinary and obnoxious guy who has nothing going for him, in my personal view. But I'm not supposed to express political opinions. Unpopular people get nominated. Well, the fact is, don't vote. This chart here shows the entire population of the United States. First off, the yellow people part is people who can't vote at all, children, people who aren't citizens. The orange part is people who don't bother voting at all. Then the green part is people who vote, but they don't vote in the primaries, but they might vote in the election itself. So you only have a very small percentage of people who participate in the primaries. And as you can see, they didn't win that much in the primary. Clinton at least won a majority of the people who voted in the primaries. Trump didn't even win a majority among the Republicans in the Republican primaries. He just won a plurality. There were so many. There were so many candidates. He won the most votes, but it wasn't even a majority. So very unpopular people as candidates. Now, okay, so it's sort of like the game we used to play when we were kids. Which would you rather do, sit on a hot stove or drink a pail of boiling water? Get elected president. And the market now, there's the Iowa electronic betting markets where people can bet on the elections. And it's showing about a 67% likelihood of a Clinton victory. Which, this is supposedly the wisdom of crowds, and they know what's going to happen. There's this website called 538, the total number of electoral votes, as I mentioned. This is run by a very smart guy named Nate Silver, who has a very good record. Polls, well, he's a very good statistician. He's got a very good record of using polls to predict the election on a state-by-state basis. He gives Clinton a 56% chance versus 44% for Trump. So he says Clinton's going to win by 21 electoral votes, but even he admits the polls are very close in many swing states, and Clinton doesn't have enough clear leads in enough states to guarantee victory. If you look at the map, you can see the key surprises for me is that Ohio and Florida are light pink states, and so she might lose both of those. If she does, and she doesn't in Colorado, then really she's out. It's a very narrow path. 21 electoral votes is one major state could throw it for her. By the way, this 538 website also says that the Democrats might win control of the Senate. Easier to pass laws, but still the Republicans would have control of the House of Representatives, and you still have a stalemate between those two, much less between the legislative and the executive branch. So, least popular people going neck and neck, Tweedledum and Tweedledummer, as some people would have it. Let's discuss their policies and what they are thinking. Clinton, trade has become a major issue in this election, which is kind of unusual. Up to now, there's really been a consensus on both parties of free trade. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have largely been in favor of free trade. Clinton has expressed some skepticism about trade, but basically she's in favor of free trade. She represents keeping the situation as it is, the status quo. The main focus of her trade policy is to enforce existing trade laws. She wants to prevent abuse, particularly with regards to labor standards. A lot of countries don't enforce pollution controls. They don't allow unions. When was the last time you heard of an independent union in China, for example? These are infractions of the trade agreements. She wants to enforce them to make a more level playing field among countries. She does oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big trade negotiation for Asia and the West, which is she had supported it, but then when it became clear that election trend. This cycle, people were turning anti-trade. She turned around to oppose it. Trump, on the other hand, has come out there hasn't been anybody against trade, so strongly against free trade since Mr. Smoot and Mr. Hartley set off the Depression in 1928. Smoot-Hawley, I think it was. He said he would rip up existing trade negotiations. He's talking about withdrawing from the World Trade Organization. That's like upsetting the whole global trading system. He wants to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Association, which ties Mexico and Canada in with the US in a free trade association, and the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement. He wants to impose a 35% tariff on imports from Mexico, as well as famously building a wall in between the US and Mexico, and a 45% tariff on imports from China. And you can guess what his view on the TPP is. Now, independent analysts have said this would deeply harm the American economy. Well, this is the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And they tend to be internationalists and globalists. They're not run by a trade union. The AFL-CIO is going to have a different view on this. They said, well, Clinton's stated trade policy would be harmful. Policy would be horribly destructive. Clinton, mostly because she rejects the TPP, which would increase trade, I think, but Trump's proposals would, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If the US imposes 45% tariffs on imports from China, China is going to impose 45% tariffs on imports from the US, and so is Europe and everything. So this is what happened in the 1920s and how we got the Depression. Everybody threw up trade barriers, trade cycled down, and we would unleash a trade war that would send the US economy into a recession. It cost millions of Americans their jobs. And I believe this completely. So that's trade policy. Fiscal policy. Clinton wants to increase spending by about $1.7 trillion, but she also wants to increase revenues by $1.5 trillion, mostly by raising taxes on higher earnings. So net, she's going to increase the debt by about $200 billion over the next decade. Key thing I think is $300 billion in infrastructure spending. I think is a very good idea. Trump wants to reduce spending by $1.2 trillion. He's going to increase spending on defense, but cut spending on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, Medicaid, and discretionary spending by $3.2 trillion. The same time that he's going to reduce spending by $1.2 trillion, he's going to cut revenues by $5.8 trillion, mostly by cutting taxes. So he's going to increase the debt by $5.3 trillion over the next decade. Here, you see the blue is Democrat, the red is Republican, and you can see how Clinton is pretty well balanced, and Trump just blows the deficit up completely. How about monetary policy? There's nothing to say about Clinton on monetary policy because most presidents and presidential candidates don't discuss it. The Fed is independent. They just appoint the governors and they leave them to get on with it. Trump doesn't play by the rules. In April, he said he would support proposals to take power away from the Fed. Nonetheless, he said at that time, the best thing we have going for us is that interest rates are so low. In May, he said, I have always been a low interest rate person. And he said, if they raise interest rates, the dollar would strengthen and that would cause problems for the US economy, which is maybe the smartest thing he has ever said. But then suddenly in September, he says, I think the Fed is being totally controlled. They're not raising rates and they're being controlled politically. He says they're keeping interest rates low in order to get Obama reelected. He says, Fed Chair Yellen should be ashamed of herself. The only quote, Ms. Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, said, I have my differences with aspects of Fed policy, but Trump is talking nonsense. But even the fact that he talks it is disturbing to the markets because usually the presidents don't make any comments about monetary policy. So this is why the election is really a binary outcome for the Forex market. The markets like stability, and they dislike uncertainty. Clinton is a known quantity. She is actually presenting herself as the continuation of the Obama. Obama is presenting her as that. Okay, people might have their differences with her. Some people like the TPP, some people don't, blah, blah, blah. But what we're talking about is the usual kind of change of policy that you would get from one administration to the other. Trump, on the other hand, would bring at least what he says, would bring erratic and radical policy. He would blow up, his plans would blow up the deficit. He even talks about restructuring the government's debt. This is a guy who's declared bankruptcy 4 times. He doesn't see any problem with the US declaring bankruptcy too. He'd set off the worst trade war since the 1930s. He'd want to withdraw troops from Japan and South Korea and scale back on NATO. This would change the global balance of power. Now, we saw that because of the checks and balances, he can't do all of this, but he can do some of it. And this is very frightening. It would be really destabilizing for the market. So there's no question about which the FX market is. Now, we don't have any history of these people, so we can't show you what happened in their previous administrations, but I'm going to take 2 people and compare them with some people in the past. Trump really is like Berlusconi, the Italian prime minister, who was very famous for not knowing very much about economics and having a lot of girlfriends, which I think pretty much sums up Mr. Trump. If we look at the graph on the left, it shows the Italian lira during Berlusconi's first term. Okay, the lira actually gained against the dollar, that's the yellow line, but the dollar was generally weak. If we look at the lira against the Deutschmark, that's the blue line, we can see that pretty much right after Berlusconi was elected, it started weakening and weakening and weakening, and just kept weakening. Of course, the lira was always a weak currency, so there's not, I'm not sure that that's conclusive. We look at his second term, then Italy was part of the euro, so we don't have a lira to look at. We can look at the spread of Italian bonds over German bonds, compared with the spread of Spanish bonds over German bonds. So the yellow line is Italy, the blue line is Spain. You can see that Spain went pretty much traded through Germany at some points. Spain isn't the healthiest country in the world either. Meanwhile, Italian bonds, as Berlusconi was in office, the spread widened and widened, showing the financial market's discomfort with this guy. I think this is what would happen when if Trump were in. And Trump is going to do a trade war, going to start trade wars. What happens to the dollar during trade wars? Well, we do have a situation in 2002 when President Bush imposed tariffs on foreign steel. Pretty much right when that happened, the dollar started falling. This is the US trade weighted index against major currencies. Shortly after they lifted the tariffs, the dollar started recovering. So it's pretty clear that trade wars work against the dollar. But this is why I think Trump would be a disaster for the dollar. On the other hand, well, we don't know what happened with Hillary Clinton, but we do know what happened with Bill Clinton. And their policies can't be so radical. I mean, they did marry each other, so radically different. The dollar actually did very well during Bill Clinton's time in office. Okay, at the beginning, they had Lloyd Bentsen as Treasury Secretary. He wasn't so great. Then Clinton appointed Robert Rubin. Rubin's mantra was, a strong dollar is in the interest of the United States. And the dollar got stronger and stronger as a result, without him doing anything. It's sort of like magic. So people will remember that and say, okay, with one Clinton, we had a good dollar. Maybe we'll have a good Clinton dollar with the other Clinton. Okay? The Democrats, just in general over history, tend to be better for the US economy than Republicans. Going back to 1929, here the reds are the Republicans, the blue administrations, the blues are the Democrats. And you can see on the graph both the average year and the median year. when there was a Democratic president, the US economy did better. Same thing for the dollar. When there was a Democratic president, the dollar did better than when there was a Republican president. So the conclusion is, if Hillary Clinton wins, I think the dollar stays on its current course, whatever that course is. First off, she represents continuity, so no major changes in policy. It is independent. And, you know, Yellen has many more years left to go in her term. She's got a 14-year term. I think she's maybe 1 or 2 years into it. So it's Fed policy nowadays really that's moving the dollar, not so much what the president is doing. But I think there would just be continuity, and I think there would also be some relief that Trump didn't get in. For example, this graph shows the performance of the Mexican peso, the white line, and the US stock market futures, the yellow line, during the debate on Monday. And you can see before the debate started at 1 o'clock GMT. So you can see before 1 o'clock they're pretty even. They start talking half an hour into the talk, but it's clear that Clinton is doing better than Trump. The Mexican peso and the stock market take off, because there's sort of a risk premium in there if there's a possibility of Trump getting in, and that's being lifted. The Mexican peso is really the barometer for the economy for two things. One, because of the risks that NAFTA, which would have a big impact on the US and on Mexico, and secondly, this idea of keeping out Mexican immigrants and building a wall. Mexican immigrants send back a lot of money back to Mexico from the US, repatriating funds. So that would really hit Mexico. The Canadian dollar is also affected by the elections too, because of the NAFTA. That's really the Mexican peso. You know, people think of the Mexican peso as a petrocurrency because of their large petroleum exports, but actually Mexico exports more manufactured goods than it does petroleum, or the value of its manufactured goods is greater than the value of its petroleum exports because of NAFTA. I don't know about the net value, because obviously some of those are just assembled out of imported parts, but they do have a very big manufacturing export base because of NAFTA. So if Trump starts to lead, I think we would see this graph upside down. Now, what's the usual impact of the dollar or of elections on the dollar? The graph on the left shows the performance of the US trade-weighted index against the major currencies around presidential elections. We've seen that going into presidential elections, generally the dollar is, on average, the dollar is stronger, and it continues to rise afterwards. You know, this may just be an accident. It might have nothing to do with the election, might have nothing, but I just took all the elections since 1972, since the dollar started floating, and this is the result we get. Curiously, in the run-up to an election, the dollar does better when it's a two-term president leaving office. That's the yellow line. Shows all the instances when you have a two-term president leaving office, as opposed to a president being re-elected or whatever. I have no idea why this is. Maybe people think a new president is going to somehow come in and have better policies. Maybe this just shows the markets are very hopeful. That's the only thing I could think of. Or again, it could just be random. But this is why, assuming, I think if Trump starts to lose and the Trump risk premium comes out of the dollar, I think we could see a stronger dollar in the run-up to the election. On the other hand, if it looks like Trump's going to win, then it's the exact opposite. After the election, the key, I think, is going to be fiscal policy. Both candidates are talking about more fiscal spending. There might be more willingness on the part of the Congress to pass spending bills, especially if the Democrats get the Senate. Then you could see more push for greater spending. the same time, the Fed is likely to continue tightening policy. This little table here shows the interaction between fiscal policy and monetary policy. When you have a loose fiscal policy and a tight monetary policy, the currency tends to strengthen. And that's what I think would happen under a Clinton presidency. Under Trump, I think just, well, the risk premium would come in, and who knows what would happen. But this is what I think would happen with a Clinton presidency. No matter who comes into office, they're probably going to start paying more attention to what other countries are doing on their foreign exchange policy. You know, twice a year, the US Treasury puts out a report on other countries' foreign exchange policies, and it's quite remarkable. For example, they never claimed China was manipulating its foreign exchange rate, even while China was accumulating $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. How $3 trillion of foreign exchange intervention is not manipulating their currency, I don't know. But I think either way, either candidate is going to focus more on other countries' foreign exchange policies. And that could be difficult for China, that could be difficult actually for Japan, definitely for Taiwan. There's more focus on what emerging market countries in particular I think are doing to keep their currencies from appreciating. That may force them to intervene less and may allow them to intervene to let their currencies appreciate more. So we could get a rally in emerging market currencies based on this. So that's my view on the election. It's the market thinks Clinton is going to win, but it's not sure yet. If Clinton wins, I think we carry on as is. If Trump wins, well, I think the Canadian dollar will strengthen because so many Americans will move to Canada. And now, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask me any questions. We've got the chat line up and running, and if you can put up any questions in the chat line. Are there any questions? Okay, well, just to sum up, I think this is the strangest election anybody has ever seen, anybody living has ever seen. Two very unpopular candidates. One of them representing continuity and therefore bullish for markets. Radical change, radical, unstructured, uneducated change, who would really tear up a lot of the, or says he would tear up a lot of the basis of the modern world, the world trade and economic and financial institutions, which creates a lot of uncertainty. I think we would be looking at sort of a Brexit type event. I think that would be bad for the dollar, bad for risk assets, bad for stock markets, and bad for America, bad for the world. So I tell you, I don't like Mr. Trump. And I think it's going to be very close. You have to watch the electoral votes, not the popular votes. And to keep up with it, look at the website 538. Thank you very much. This is Marshall Gittler, Head of Investment Research at FXPRIMUS, the safest place to trade.